All right, I don't know if you guys heard the song playing. It was Money by Pink Floyd, which seems like a fitting intro to our next presenter. Josh Bloom heads up the software and internet practice at Simon Kucher, and they've presented a lot of our events. So we do, Licensing Live has started to go quite global, and they've spoken at our events in Paris, in Munich, in Tel Aviv. And one of the reasons that we really like having their perspective is they live in the world of pricing and monetization, quite closely associated with software licensing and monetization, but there are subtle differences. And Josh is going to touch on those subtle but very important distinctions between pricing and licensing and how that fits into your overall monetization strategy. Welcome to the stage, Josh.
Thank you. Thanks. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back from the break. Excited to see such a good turnout in a great room. How many people have seen me speak before? Okay, that's a good showing, but I do have new material. I'm working on it as well. So there should be something for everyone. Excited to be back at Licensing Live. After that intro, I don't have to do too much context building. As a company, Simon Kucher has been preaching the gospel of pricing and monetization strategy for over 35 years. We're a truly global company, 38 offices worldwide, more than 1,200 people, just focused on these top-line growth projects. So pricing is about half of the work we do, and we also work on strategy, marketing, and sales. So the fact base I'm bringing today is a combination of my own personal experience, having worked at the firm for the last 15 years, working with over 100 tech companies in that time period, but also pulling on our experience around the world. And I have 3 goals for this session, 3 goals that will hopefully translate to takeaways. One is a little bit of a context setting of making sure we're on the same page with why these topics are so important and why they're kind of getting management attention now. Second goal is to provide some frameworks to help you structure your own thinking around challenges you might be facing at your companies. And the third goal is to provide kind of really specific success stories that will hopefully serve as inspiration for you as you kind of leave the room today. And I'll stick around afterwards if people have questions as well. But I'm going to start with the broader context. So yes, we've been banging the drum for 35 years. Others are starting to catch on as well. It's not just our own kind of leadership thinkers that are praising this message. It's leaders like Warren Buffett saying pricing power is the most important element of evaluating a business. Steve Ballmer calling it really, really important. And Bill Gurley, you might know, is the head of Benchmark Capital, who wrote a foreword to our latest book, and we worked with a number of his portfolio companies. He's talking here about the importance of really understanding the core unit model economics, even at a startup. And he's really not talking there about making sure you're getting your cost structure down. He's talking about pricing. So why, if this is such an important topic, is this not something that has been solved by every company in the world? Well, a lot of companies are under pricing pressure. So we do a global survey of C-level executives, and I'll share some of the results. There's a big challenge in place. So 82% of companies say they are experiencing even higher pricing pressure in recent years. And where is that coming from? For most folks, that's coming from stronger competition. Yes, there's elements of kind of procurement and purchasing in there, greater price transparency, but it's really the competition that's driving pricing pressure. Okay, so what does that mean in practice? Are companies engaged in price wars? Actually, yes. Half of companies say they are actively engaged in a price war with their direct competitors. And another 20% say there are other players in the market who are engaging in a price war, but we're not partaking. So those half of companies, those executives who said they're currently engaged in a price war, what percentage do you think admit that they started that price war? Anybody want to throw out a number? Zero. It's not quite zero, but 86% say the competitors started that price war. I really appreciate the 8% who admitted not only did they start the price war, but they started it accidentally. That's a really high level of self-awareness. But unfortunately, most companies do not fit that kind of self-aware profile. These numbers are hard to believe. Essentially, I think there's a lot more who are in that bucket who have started a price war inadvertently. Okay, so whether you're in a price war or not, there's significant competitive threats. What can you do to overcome that? One thing that companies do is invest in the topic of price management and price optimization. So we cut our data of these couple thousand respondents to see of those companies who had invested in price optimization or pricing and licensing and things along those lines, what their financial results were versus the ones that hadn't. Okay, selfishly, we're calling the ones who had invested the best. But essentially, the best companies versus the rest, the best had higher EBITDA margins. They were able to achieve higher price increases. And maybe most importantly, the share of new products which met their profit targets, more than half for companies that invest in pricing versus less than a quarter for the rest. So it's not just about maintaining your ability to optimize pricing for existing products, but it even gets into the sausage making of making sure you have successful product launches going forward. And that's really what most companies are looking at to kind of escape difficult market conditions. That first bucket here, that's the most common response to how to escape oppressive market conditions, is create new and innovative products. But ultimately, those launches have to be successful. So I could talk for a long time about that top row here, but I'm actually going to spend the most of the time talking about the second row here. The second row being changing your revenue model and the way customers think about price and value. And this is really where I'll kind of use as a jumping off point to talk about pricing and licensing. So first of all, raise your hand if your company has considered changing their pricing or, let's say, licensing model. All right. I think that is about the average. Now, how many have actually gone through with it? I saw about 2/3 of people raise their hands. Ooh, very small percentage going through with it. I'm sure there are a lot of folks in this room who are experienced who can help. But that's not too different from what we see in the broader market. 2/3 of companies are thinking, or at least working, exploring new pricing or licensing models, but a lot of them are in this kind of vague initiative stage. And kind of getting to that active planning is really rare. So why is that? I think hopefully I will demystify some of the changes that are required to tackle that. But last 2 points here of kind of how these models are changing in general. I think at various points today you'll hear a lot about kind of subscription licensing models and things along those lines. Just last 2 points from a additional context perspective. This is not just this one industry that's going through this type of change in the technology space. It's everywhere. Kind of the share of GDP associated with services relative to goods has been changing pretty systematically over the last 30 years. This isn't something that started yesterday. And the Wall Street expectations and kind of growth implied in the multiples also indicate that subscription businesses are valued much higher on a standardized basis, whether you're looking at revenue or EBITDA. So those are the market signals. Those are some of the conditions that companies are in. How do they solve this? How do they escape some of these pressures? And I'll talk about 2 different ways. So the first is through pricing, which I'll talk about as an exercise in controlled differentiation. It is really about taking control as an organization and understanding what price is appropriate in different situations. And I'll also talk about licensing as a dimension of flexibility that you can offer customers and let them choose. So pricing first. When we talk about pricing, it's not pricing at one moment in time. In fact, if you look at the economics of a subscription business, and this is a study with a few hundred SaaS companies, and you look at what it takes to acquire $1 of ACV, annual contract value, basically your recurring revenue line. How much does it cost to acquire $1 of ACV from a new logo and kind of a greenfield customer? more than $1 on average, implying that the payback period is more than a year. What does it cost to acquire revenue associated with upsell or cross-sell? Kind of either bringing somebody to a higher tier or selling them a new functionality, much better, kind of 27 cents on average, only 3 months essentially till payback period. That's great. The ones that are really highest leverage here are the last two, usage-based licensing, kind of installing a licensing model that allows you to monetize on usage, 20 cents on the dollar, and increasing pricing at renewal, which could be due to softer usage factors or other indicators of value, kind of getting a price increase from a customer success team, et cetera, even lower, 13 cents. So this is really where you start to see this land and expand model achieve significant gains. It's not in the initial land, it's making sure you have the mechanisms in place to tap into that expansion revenue, which is much less costly than compensating sales and marketing for all of that activity. Okay, so what do companies do specifically? That's more the context. The framework is here. How do companies think about this? If they're thinking about optimizing a land and expand strategy, and they're thinking about using pricing to do that, it's traditional topics that we think about in most kind of marketing background, things like packaging, segmentation, price model, but there's a little bit different spin usually when it comes to a subscription offering. So for packaging, companies are thinking about, do we have the right fencing in place between our packages to ensure that there are opportunities to organically upsell somebody over time without having a salesperson have to call them? Are we seeding premium features so that people can experience higher value elements of our product architecture without having to pay for them up front? Most technology products are experiential goods, so giving somebody a flavor of what they could be purchasing later on. From a segmentation perspective, we're thinking about things like, are you targeting different use cases or roles within an organization? Are you able to sell to part of an organization, build goodwill, and then sell to other parts of an organization? Price increases, I also mentioned here as important. And I put this under the segmentation category because the most effective price increase campaigns, we'll talk about this later, are ones that are not applied at a blanket level, 5% across the entire customer base, but ones that are able to differentiate customers who are achieving significant value versus ones that are churn risks if you push too hard. And the last one here, pricing model. From a structural perspective, are you overcoming budgetary hurdles? And from a metering licensing perspective, are you drafting on some organic growth metric? So I'm actually going to start at that bottom one here. So that's the framework. Here are some examples. So what do I mean by tying yourself to a fundamentally growing metric? There's actually two examples on this slide. I'll talk about the one on the left first. This is from a software company that had been user-based historically. They did fundraising software. You can think of it as in the broader CRM category. And their revenues on a customer level were pretty flat year over year because fundamentally, once you trained everyone in your organization to use the new software platform, there wasn't a lot of place for users to grow. And nonprofits, et cetera, aren't usually the kind of companies that expand naturally. So user-based pricing wasn't really tapping into what the value of the system was over time. Over time, that database of kind of fundraising software is getting more and more records and richer records with more detail associated with them. So the actual fundraising you're able to achieve using the software dramatically increases over time. So how do you map back to something that actually ties to that growth? In this case, we're able to switch to a records-driven, database-driven metric, which when we looked at data, grew 14% a year on average. So we went from something that was a low single digits growth rate to 14% per year growth rate. We built in some volume discounting curves to lessen the impact, but ultimately switching metrics is one of the things that really drove kind of organic growth opportunities in the company, and also even allowed them to be more aggressive with those new logo deals. The example on the right is from collaboration software. And I bring this one in here because it forces you to think about changing the way you perceive the traditional volume-based discounting structure. Everybody thinks the more you buy, the less you should pay. But what if you have a collaboration product and you're trying to sell to one small piece of the organization? The most important thing to do is get your foot in the door. And in this case, that realization led to a much cheaper entry-level offering. The first 10 users, $10 per user per month. Pretty much thereafter, users are, instead of $1 per month, almost $7 or $8 per month. But the idea being that first group that you're trying to sell to, that initial adoption point, is something that you can create a less friction in the adoption if you actually have the first bundle that's discounted. So different ways to think about tying your licensing and your pricing to growth metrics and to play around with volume discounting to change adoption hurdles. The second point on that kind of triangle was around segmentation. So this is a view of a highly undifferentiated offering. This is a pricing page for a company, SmugMug. A number of years ago, this example is a few years old, they offered this kind of good, better, best looking four-tiered offering that stretched across 2 pages, and if you can't read it on the slide, that's intentional. Nobody could read it, but made it very complex to understand what you were actually paying for. So I would think of this as kind of a feature-driven packaging approach. I could see a few nods of recognition from those in the room. I think a lot of tech companies still have landing pages that look like this. Okay, same product, new landing page. That's it. That's it. Changing their landing page resulted in a 60% increase in conversion and profitability overnight. And there are a couple things that make this work. Obviously, you are signaling with the titles what segment these packages are for, so people can better self-identify. You are not highlighting features anymore, you're highlighting the value you get, and also highlighting the value you get as you move up. So that the ones that stick out are the title, the price, and the incremental value in that bottom row of what you get from relative to the package before. So if you pick the second column, you're adding features that allow you to create robust personalization. If you're third column, you're getting a set of features that allow you to sell photos online. You'll notice there's also a little plus mark. You can unclick and you can see all the features underneath that if you so desire. But fundamentally, you're not facing this kind of cognitive overload from the initial perspective. Okay, so that's a little bit on kind of communication, on segmentation, making sure you have clear value propositions for your different offerings. The last one I'll touch on is price, in this section, is price increases. So this really is kind of tied to more the opening song. This is about the money. It is about really understanding willingness to pay and looking at this through a few different lenses. One is, if you're in a transactional business that's somewhat negotiated, you'll have a distribution of prices over time. And maybe the only signal you need is what people are paying now versus what similar companies have paid elsewhere. So we often talk about looking at the annual renewal process as partially looking at a peer set increase of understanding who are the real underperformers from a price perspective and trying to move the left side of the distribution up to the mean with their similar peers. So you could think of this as looking at this on a segment basis by product ownership or any other segmentation variables to understand what similar companies are paying. You can also look at kind of the traditional shift of saying we're changing our list prices, something has changed in our product, we're moving those. But the secret sauce might be the third column here, and that's really kind of looking at some of the behavioral metrics. So looking at the telemetry enabled view of how people are using your software, your technology, really understanding who is deriving significant value out of your software. Customers, again, most of these products, these tech products we're talking about, are experiential goods. You don't buy just based on a feature list. You buy based on how it changes your business processes. And you renew based on that as well. So if fundamentally you have seen value, you should be willing to pay more, and you can kind of lean into price increases. There are others that might have low usage or significant support issues, et cetera, that you might want to lean back to avoid churn. And using that kind of logic to differentiate price increases is that last bit. And again, this is usually the cheapest revenue to go find. Because it's usually not commissioned, it's usually kind of customer success initiative, and you can do it at scale. As in, you can do this type of analysis across your customer base and push out price increases kind of one to many. Okay, that's the pricing side. Last 10 minutes, I want to talk about licensing. And this is a little bit different. So in pricing, you can see, it, as I described, it's a lot about control differentiation. It's about taking control, creating the optics. I'll talk about licensing a little bit differently as the domain of the value of flexibility as a competitive weapon. So obviously, there are lots of undercurrents that I've talked about of kind of why subscription licensing models are gaining traction. I won't dwell too much on that. I'll say that in addition to kind of traditional pricing licensing, I brought up in that collaboration example the idea of structure as well, of kind of how you think about monetization as volume grows. Is it purely linear per unit? Is it on the spectrum 100% fixed, as in you're paying a flat fee, versus on the other side 100% variable and linear? And there are lots in between. It could be two-dimensional pricing with a platform fee plus usage-based. All of these factors kind of go into the concept of who is bearing the risk in this transaction. Are you bearing the risk as a vendor by giving them some type of flat fee irrespective of usage? Or are they bearing the risk as a customer based on their potential high bookings as a result of their usage? So a lot of companies will try to find a middle ground. I'll give an example here of Microsoft's upfront purchase flexibility here. So this is specifically for one of their products where you can buy essentially a debit card that gets used down, that gets spent down. So if you spend $20,000 on Azure services, you can essentially work against that and get credit, the volume discounting for your $20,000 commitment, but you also have the ability to burst, you have the ability to top up. Essentially, they've created a model that shares some of that risk. They've locked in a certain amount of revenue that might not cover the entire spend for that company for the year. But on the other hand, they've given some pricing consistency to the customer as well, and the ability to control their spend over time if their usage changes. I'll talk also on a pure licensing model perspective. I'll use an example of a tech company that is now a public company. This is all public information, who is undergoing kind of a significant and accelerated transition. It's Nutanix, hyperconverged infrastructure. In a few short years, they have basically set as a mandate to transition not just from a hardware company to a software company, but then also going to a subscription licensing model. So this company was only founded in 2009, IPO'd in September 2016. And if you look, I've kind of color-coded some of what's happening under the covers here, and you can track this back in their recent reporting. So they started, as many kind of tech companies do, as a proprietary hardware and software package shipped as an appliance. It's a box model. And they were doing that through contract manufacturers. But then they started to diversify, and they said, well, we actually have customer segments who have different preferences for different hardware vendors. They have key account relationships. Let's create OEM partnerships. So they created OEM partnerships, first with Dell and Lenovo, then IBM. And they said, well, there are also companies who want the ability to bring your own hardware. So let's create third-party hardware, qualified third-party hardware, and we're just selling a software license, starting with Cisco and then adding others over time. So if you think about what's happening under the hood here, they're offering these different models. When they're selling a proprietary hardware and software appliance, You can do things like life of device models. When you start to get into third-party hardware, you need to start thinking about alternative licensing models. Well, isn't this an opportunity to introduce term-based software licensing models, especially for that third-party software component? There's another interesting thing that they did from a financial engineering perspective was they convinced their distributors to split the customer PO, even in an OEM partnership model, to create a hardware to software price model. Hardware and software POs, so that they were no longer keeping the hardware on their books. And you can see the impact on their gross margin, 60% as they started this. As they really ramped up this idea of kind of split POs, gross margins hit 70%. So it's a story already of a company that's kind of undergone multiple elements of that transformation of changing from a hardware mindset to a software mindset, and starting to think about term licensing models, and eventually getting into cloud services, consumption-based pricing, et cetera. But I think what's inspiring about this is the time scale they were able to achieve all of this on. Again, kind of less than 10 years, they've gone through that full transition and now offer multiple licensing models. I'll go to the other end of the spectrum, less transactional, more negotiated. This is a big deal example. It's an example of a healthcare IT company, mix of software, hardware, services, selling into large integrated hospital systems, public healthcare systems. They provide healthcare workflow software. Budgets are shrinking, lots of consolidation in the marketplace, new SaaS entrants. They decided to take undertake a whole review of their pricing and licensing approach. They built out functional packages to appeal to different stakeholders. They moved to a pricing structure that rewards growth, especially as a lot of these others were consolidating, and they offered kind of multiple licensing models underneath that. So what did that mean from a practical perspective? Again, these are large deals. It meant that when they walked into the negotiations, they no longer had one way of doing business as a company. They were able to talk to these large hospital networks and say, let's sit down together and figure out the most optimal way for us to fit into your budgeting process, your planning process. And sometimes that led to different outcomes. So I'll give you the examples of the two initial deals that were rolled out as part of this program. Primary metric ended up being different, study volume versus percent of revenue. Software was always included in the subscription. Maintenance was always included. Services were different. Sometimes it was included, sometimes it was bank of hours. Hardware included or still a separate capital expenditure. But by signaling this flexibility and working closely with their customers to identify the ideal model, they were able to displace competitive alternatives. And their first two pilot deals went from $8 million to $35 million committed in one deal, and $20 million to $133 committed in another. And this was, again, not changing anything fundamental about the product itself, just changing how they interacted with their customers, offering that type of flexibility, and having the systems in place to be able to offer that flexibility created these long-term partnerships. Okay, I'm going to wrap here with 1 to 2 more slides. Wrap up. Thank you. Thank you. Last slide here, just as a point to say, this is not just a technology industry change. Fundamentally, any industry can undertake this, even tires. This is a famous example of Michelin, who created a new version of their tire. They didn't think they could pass through a significant price increase, so what did? They changed the revenue model. They worked directly with trucking companies to change, instead of from a per tire fee to a per mile fee, or kilometer in this case, to basically capture that incremental value they had created of longer lasting tires. So again, this type of licensing and pricing model flexibility is kind of key to unlocking these competitive gains. Just to summarize, pricing is more of an exercise of controlled differentiation, making sure you're really hitting those main steps of land and expand model, and focusing maybe a little bit more on the expand than folks do on the land. And licensing model really comes down to flexibility. Can you offer consumption models and different patterns for different customer segments? Thanks, everyone. I'm wrapping up here, but happy to take questions at the break.